Welcome to Compassionate Cultures, the podcast. You're about to go on a journey of empathy, understanding, and transformation. Get ready to dive into the heart of humanity's most pressing questions with me, Rebecca Hemmings, the CEO of Strawberry Words Training Consultancy, and guests. It's time to turn up the volume on kindness and to amplify the voices of minorities that often go unheard. This podcast asks questions like, how can we create workplaces where ethnic minorities thrive without the chains of career stagnation? What if universities were safe havens for all, free from the storm of microaggressions? And how can we bridge the gaps between cultures that have been divided by the walls of bias and ignorance? This is not just a podcast. This is a revolution of empathy. Welcome to Compassionate Cultures, the podcast. Get ready to explore, learn, and change the world one compassionate conversation at a time. So, welcome back to the Compassionate Cultures podcast. I'm Rebecca Hemmings, your host, and I am joined today by Dr. Rebecca Eldredge, who is a speaker, facilitator, and a licensed psychologist who supports clients and organizations in integrating mental health, cultural competence, and social justice. Welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to talk with you.
Yeah, likewise. I mean, I've done a lot of moving around your LinkedIn page and your website, and I'm really fascinated by your work, particularly obviously because what we do, the social justice aspects of psychology. How fascinating. So I'm going to jump straight in there because you know there's a lot going on in the world at the moment, and we'll come to how you got to where you are later. But there are, just before we started recording this, I was just saying that it's a very difficult time in the world at the moment with the conflict that's happening in Gaza and Israel. There are many people who are having to turn up to work and are expected to function as normal, but perhaps, whether they're affected personally by having relatives in those areas, or whether just because of who they are, they feel a certain way. What are some words of comfort as a psychologist? What are some words of comfort that you perhaps can offer them in this time?
One thing is there's no words that capture the amount of suffering that's happening right now. And so any words that I say knowing that they're wholly inadequate to really address what's happening. The thing that I think is really important, though, for people to know and remember is that their emotions are completely appropriate and valid.
Yeah.
I think so much additional suffering comes when we either try to tell ourselves that we should just move on, get over it, push through, don't let it affect us, or when we hear that from others, come on, just everything should be fine. And that adds a whole other layer of struggle and stress. So, one of the things I would say is, of course, when there's so much suffering, if you're human and you're connected to your humanity and you have loved ones, or you yourself are identifying with some of the affected parties and the conflict, then of course you're going to have very intense emotions and it's going to affect you. And so not to judge yourself or others for that, and to look at how do you care for yourself with those emotions? What are the ways that you can make some time and space for that, so that you can tend to it with compassion?
Absolutely. And I think that's really important to extend that advice with a view of, I'm thinking about managers here, managers, supervisors, people in positions of power who have these people within their workplaces, within whether it's places of education or whatever. I think it is important to recognize people's humanity and understand that they're suffering, and to somehow allow that space for them to work through
what's going on. I think that's so important also, because I think sometimes people don't know what to do as as someone who wants to be an ally or not. People often are silent, and that's another question, actually. People for many reasons are scared to engage in conversations about the conflict, obviously because nobody wants to say the wrong thing or to insult someone or to offend somebody. But do you think, in your opinion, do you feel as though people should engage in some sort of conversation, or is silent? I mean, I can tell you what we will say. I guess I'm being quite leading here. I suppose we will always focus on the person and how they're feeling and be guided by them. Would you offer any other advice when it comes to engaging in any conversation around this?
Yeah, well, I'm totally with you on, that I think in an individual situation, like, your voice matters greatly, whether you're using it for what you're saying or what you're not saying, is still communicating something.
Oh, I like that.
And
yeah.
So I think that, sometimes people think it's going to be safer to stay silent, that maybe they can cause less harm if they just don't say anything. And that's a myth. There are plenty of times and examples where staying silent has caused damage and harm in and of itself. So I think that it's really important for people to know that they have the tools and to build the practice and the confidence with the variety of ways in which you can say something that are congruent with you, your personality, your style, and also respectful of the other people that you're talking to. And, if it's helpful, like, I actually have a resource that people can download that's 5 ways to speak up in those situations. One of the most underutilized, I think, is a question, that just to ask a question in the moment of, how do you feel about that? Or where does your perspective come from? What's informed how you're seeing this situation?
So just using that specific example, when might you ask that question? So how do you feel about that? Because some people are naturally curious, and in order to satisfy their curiosity, they might, out the blue, just start asking lots of questions about a particularly sensitive issue. And again, we're talking specifically about what's happening in the war situation at the moment, but it could be to do with race or any other form of discrimination, right? Where people have just randomly brought up a topic and they've asked, well, how do you feel about that? Is that okay, or would something have had to have happened beforehand?
Right. I'm glad that you're teasing that apart a bit, because I'm thinking of it in situations where somebody's already said something. Like, if for example, you, Rebecca, volunteer that you're thinking about something a lot, or something's really impacting you, then I might respond with a question. If I hear you say something that I think is a microaggression, or something that I think there's some potential bias around, or that something that I think has harmed somebody else in the room, then I might ask, like, can you tell me a little bit more about what you're saying there? So trying to give an opportunity to create more of a conversation. And I think in our previous conversation, we had talked about just how important we both feel the role of safety is for having a meaningful conversation, for having any opportunity to really connect. So I'm not talking about, like, diving in with a, like, why do you think that?
Well, I have to ask. I have to ask, but just because people do ask those questions,
of course,
and people are naturally curious, and people sometimes think that by asking questions, you're kind of being on side, you're being an ally, and you're showing that I'm not racist, or I don't discriminate, or whatever, but actually it's kind of saying something else.
Right. Yeah. And there's certainly some delicacy to what questions you ask and how you ask and when you ask. One of the things as a psychologist in our training, we're almost trained out of the question why. it's very rare that I would use a why question. And I was so surprised recently because somebody was actually telling me and asking for me on my opinion about a different therapy setting where the therapist was asking a lot of why questions. And I was just honestly so surprised.
Did you ask her why, or him, or they, whatever?
Right.
Why?
But why, of course, it's a question where it's asking somebody immediately to justify and defend a position. And so it brings up a lot of defensiveness. So I think, in a moment where you can ask a question that starts with what or how, and with genuine and authentic openness to hearing the answer.
I think that is so incredibly important that I'm just going to kind of repeat what you said, that asking the question why, when we're talking to people who are facing discrimination or oppression or a part of that group, asking the question why often puts them on the defensive. But also, actually, it's to anybody. So even if, in my work, when we're talking about discrimination, racism, so on, if I'm to challenge somebody and I start with the question why, immediately I know they are going to maybe dig their heels in, get defensive, and it's just not going to work. So I think that is such an important point, and I thank you for raising that. Yeah, absolutely. So we're talking about how to engage with people who are currently suffering, not just because of what's going on in Israel and Gaza, but also just generally, there's a lot of people who are facing, it feels like an increased amount of oppression. So I'm going to kind of dig a bit deeper on this one with you. So, that's just one of the ways in which you might engage with someone, is just by asking questions. What else can they do?
If there's a point of understanding, like I might not agree with everything that somebody says. For example, if somebody says, here's one that comes up in a corporate setting, right? Like, especially in the United States, a lot of the tension around affirmative action. And so somebody
says, just for people who don't know, who are in England or other places, can you just explain what affirmative action is?
Well, so it was based on policies that were put in place to try to level the playing field, rather than perpetuate the advantages that people from privileged groups had previously. So largely to privilege or to give opportunities that hadn't always been in existence or promoted to people who hadn't traditionally had those opportunities. So especially being women or people of color. And in fact, one of the groups that has benefited most from that, which is not always talked about, but in my understanding, the data shows that white women actually have benefited the most from that over people of color.
Yeah, it's similar here with various diversity programs.
Okay. Yeah. So there's a lot of controversy around it in the United States right now, and there's a lot of often pushback of somebody who might say, in this example, like, oh, I should have gotten that promotion. I didn't get that position. And it was only because they were hiring, a token person of color.
Yeah, who doesn't deserve it, who didn't work for it.
Right. Like implying, right, that the other person wasn't just as qualified or more qualified for that position.
Yeah.
Now, knowing the background that I know, chances are I'm not on board with everything that person just said. But I might, in that situation, look at, is there a piece of what they're saying or behind what they're saying that I can have some empathy or some understanding towards? And in that moment, maybe the piece that I can connect with is that they're really disappointed and not getting the position that they wanted. I might not agree one bit with everything that they're explaining about why. But in that moment, maybe one point of response could be, I know there have been times where I was really disappointed when I didn't get something that meant a lot to me too.
Oh, that's so kind. I'm working on that. I'm working on that in my head.
I'm working on it too.
Because I'm being totally honest, like and I'm always my intention, and I know intention's not everything, but I'm always wanting to be compassionate in conversations and see the other person's point of view, but I will also equally challenge. And so to purely find the piece where you connect first is a great way in. I totally accept that, you know, it's a great way in. No, that's it, full stop. It's a great way in. And then I'll challenge.
Right. And that's the whole point, right? Is I want a conversation to be effective.
Yeah.
So I want, and I'm not talking about this as a form of manipulation. Like if I want to have a real conversation with somebody.
Just a really quick interruption. Dealing with microaggressions, the online training workshop is coming to you soon, okay? On the 22nd of February, 1 till 3 p.m. GMT, right? So it's designed so wherever you are in the world, hopefully you can capture, you can be involved, right? What do we cover? I'm covering defining microaggressions, so people understand the different types of microaggressions that are out there. I share plenty of examples, so you will know exactly what they are. You will also know what the impact of those are and how ethnic minorities cope with microaggressions. Then, you know, the piece that people really want to know about is how do you manage difficult conversations around microaggressions when they pop up, because they can be quite fraught, quite scary. How do you deal with those, either as the ethnic minority or the person or the white person, right? And how do you come back? How, you know, when microaggressions do pop up, what can you say in defense? What can you say to highlight or to educate? What do you do when it's said? Do you just leave it, for instance? So we'll cover all of that in 2 hours. So jump on to Eventbrite. There's a link around here somewhere. And if not, go to the Strawberry Words website, strawberrywords.co.uk, Strawberry Words, WORDS.co.uk. Now back to the episode.
Which I do most of the time.
Yeah.
Then I want to be able to have them hear what I have to say.
Yeah.
And then in order for them to hear that, I can't start out already judging and attacking them.
Yeah, of course
right.
not.
And so how do we create that psychological safety in our workplaces, in our relationships, in our families? You know, how do we create that space where we can actually hear one another and bring our voices fully into the conversation? So when I'm talking about these different strategies, you know, these 5 different ways to speak up, they're all designed to facilitate an effective conversation so that you have more opportunity to move the needle by the end of that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Because what you're essentially saying is, well, what I'm doing by engaging in this way is showing you that I think you're human too, and we're going to connect on a human level. And you know, whilst we may not agree on everything, like I still respect you as a fellow person, and that's what it sounds like your techniques are communicating, which often people don't do. So, yeah.
And they're not, I mean, to be fair, like, I mean, I got taught some of these things, right? I wasn't born knowing these things either. And a lot of times people that I talk to, like, they can develop these skills. In fact, this is what can be really powerful about trainings and facilitations, is the opportunity to help whole groups of people to learn a different way to talk about things, to highlight some of their strengths and bring in their whole self. And have some of these really difficult conversations, even in the workplace.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So I was just thinking about, well, how did I learn these things? You know, and I think I've been around a lot of difficult people. And I say that with the greatest respect, but people with challenging personalities throughout my working life and personal life. And you have to learn to engage with people in a way that they will engage back with you. And so you can't instantly go in there and you're not that I'd want to, but it just wouldn't work. So you have to find ways of dealing with a wide range of people in a way, like you say, that they will hear you. So I think, that's really important. And it's important to hear, that, it can be learned, because sometimes people think, well, I'm just not naturally that sort of person. I just say how I see it. You can learn. Yeah.
Right. And most people do want to be heard at some
Yeah.
level. So like once you experience that, like, oh, this actually works, this feels better, we can get more done this way, we can have better morale, better working relationships.
Yeah.
You know, then there's a lot to be said for it.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just thinking, I had I'm just going to say a family member who was very, very argumentative. And I learned that if I just didn't argue back, if I just lowered my voice and became inquisitive and just asked questions when necessary, oh my gosh, it changed the whole nature of the conversation.
Right. And I think we
Yeah.
all have those family members somewhere.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. So it's knowing these little ways in which you can get that engagement. So I want to come back now to the beginning, because normally I would start by saying, well, how did you get into this? But I really just felt as though, if people just heard the first 5-10 minutes of this episode, that they got something, or they got ways into where we are currently. But yeah, let's go backwards. And so you are a psychologist who specializes in the work of social justice. How did that come to be? Do I sound surprised?
No, I get that question a lot, and I'm laughing because, it's one of those things where I feel like there should be really some like little sparkling moment gem that says like, oh, there was this one moment in time and it, everything just burst forth from that moment. And that's not my story. I mean, I think my story is maybe the more common story where one experience built on the next. And over time, I'll say I had experiences of traveling to study abroad. I had experiences of being involved in different service projects. I have a very privileged background in terms of my own identity. I'm not sure if this has a video associated or not, but like, if you see
Some
me,
people won't see a video.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm white, very, very white, very light-skinned, light-featured, female, cisgender female in a heterosexual marriage. I have an able-bodied experience where I've been healthy through most of my life. And so, a lot of my background is very privileged. And yet when I ran into values conflicts around what I was taught about how to see people and how to see the world and people's inherent worth, and then seeing that was not how everybody was being treated within the world, like the dissonance that creates, even at a selfish level, like just that friction inside of me, I'm not okay. Seeing that and not feeling like I'm doing something about it. And so, in that way, like just my natural strengths and tendencies, being highly sensitive, being introverted, thinking about things deeply, caring about living out my values was a direct match to psychology. I knew that from an early age.
That makes sense. Yeah.
And then those experiences that made me realize that there were times where I was not as aware, that I didn't have the comprehension, the knowledge, the understanding of different groups, different backgrounds. And I wanted to be able to have relationships that were built on understanding. And so I picked a graduate program that had a strength in multicultural issues for my studies and sought out experiences that would continue to support that. And the more I had of that, the more I love it, the more, it's rewarding for me. And so it just built on itself.
So what does that mean for your work then? So who are you working with who are you helping?
Well, I work with, there's such a wide variety. So it can be people from a lot of service professions, a lot of people who are often tasked to be change makers, whether they want to or whether it's a designated role or not, but people within organizations who, by virtue of their own identities, are often, plucked and said, hey, will you lead this diversity effort, this initiative, this committee? Or even if they're not even being identified by their organization, they're the one in the room, often the one or one of the only, who is the person who has that different perspective and that different experience, who sees what's happening and is like, if I'm not going to speak up about this, who is? And so they carry tremendous burdens of not only experiencing injustice in the systems the way that they are, but then of also trying to change the systems.
Yeah.
And so those are the people that I work with.
Yeah, just picking up on that, it's such an important point, because again, that's something we hear so often, that, you know, I'm quite perturbed because, yeah, I'm in this head of DEI position or whatever it might be, or I'm the advocate, or I'm the leader of the employee resource group, but because I'm, you know, I'm Black, because I'm Asian, because, you know, or I've got this particular job just, again, based on my skin color or my, you know, just my marginalized identity. And you know, people, and I'm saying this for the managers, the hirers that might be listening, you know, that is an incredible burden, as you say, to place on people. But also, it's what that it creates this sense of not knowing, you know, whether did I get this position simply just based on that, or is there something about my skill? Like, was there some element of merit in this, and that can create frustration and resentment added to the discrimination. It's a lot.
Right. Well, and I mean, I'm thinking of a story about what you're saying, where I was speaking at a conference, a healthcare related conference, and they had some breakout groups, and one of the breakout groups was a diversity focused breakout group. And as we were talking, somebody was saying, and she identified as a Black woman, and she was saying, you know, they came to me and they wanted me to head up this diversity group. And I told them no, because I have none of that training or expertise. You're picking me out entirely because you see my skin color. And you know, I don't want to do that. I don't want to carry that burden. And like, I applaud her for saying no. And she was talking about how, though, then they go on to the next person. And then for a lot of people that I talk to, a lot of other people that I talk to say yes, even if they have those same hesitations that this woman had expressed, because they're like, if I don't say yes to this, then who's going to do it?
Yeah, and they feel that pressure.
Yeah. And so it's a tremendous source of depletion.
Yeah, it certainly is. You know, because the phrase came to mind that, you know, just because you drive a Lamborghini doesn't mean you know how to repair one. You know, mechanics, the same kind of thing. You know, it does take a lot of skill. And, you know, I had to recognize coming into this role, because we always spoke about cultural awareness, but we then decided to focus on race. I had to be very clear on what that would mean, on knowing that I do see a therapist very regularly, knowing that you have to take breaks, because not on top of having to learn all this stuff and continue to learn, you feel it as well, you know. And so it's tricky, and particularly if you don't have any support around you. And so obviously that's what you're doing, is you're offering support. Just on, I mean, I was reading one of your blogs before you came on, and it was about the allostatic load that
the allostatic load.
Allostatic, that's it, allostatic load, which is the wear and tear. Do you want to explain that?
Yeah, well, it's the wear and tear on the body of pervasive, kind of chronic, cumulative stresses over time. And so it can come from a lot of different sources, but if you look at sources of chronic stress, then certainly experiences of oppression or marginalization are right up there.
Yeah. So, you know, again, it's knowing that, you know, I always say to people, keep reading, keep learning about this beast that is discrimination and racism, because then you will find out things like this. So as someone who's placing that burden upon someone to take on such a role, understanding that actually can have a physical effects. It can lead to serious illness, not that, and it's just that, but it can add to the pressure.
Right. Yeah, you're adding another thing. And so often people in these roles are tasked with doing them without additional compensation, without a reduction in other responsibilities of their role. So it's kind of just an add-on that requires something extra, but there's not really any, there's not any rebalancing of what else is expected at the same time. And not always being offered support, like mental, emotional support, coaching support, a team, a committee, like trainings. So being tasked with, here, like, do this. And I say this somewhat flippantly, although I don't mean it that way, but make our organization look good. We want, and maybe for genuine desire to be doing the right thing. I do believe that most people have good intentions, which is part of what's hard. Like they also don't want to be in trouble with their public image. But perhaps behind also not wanting to be in trouble with their public image, they do want to be known as a good employer, a good organization, a nice place to work, a place that treats their employees well. And that certainly serves them better when it comes to attraction of talent and retention, recruitment, all the things. And yet, when you're asking people to do this, this additional work, then understanding there's so much wear and tear that goes along with that, especially if the person is still experiencing the microaggressions, the system as it is today.
So taking that worker as an avatar, as an example, what one piece of advice, if there is one, could you offer, knowing that, that whilst leaving is an option, it's not really a realistic option. What can they do? What can they do when they feel as though they're constantly being seen and used for their identity, as well as being on the receiving end of those microaggressions?
What can they do?
Yeah. What piece of advice might you give them?
Well,
okay, let me change that, because I know you're not really an advice giving sort of in that sort of role, but you're in you ask questions around that. So what key question might you ask them to help them start thinking about how they might navigate this?
So I would ask, and I appreciate you recognizing that, like, I also feel like it would be very arrogant of me in my body to be telling other people, here's what to do. So I would ask the question, how are you tending to what you need? How are you taking care of what limits you set, what boundaries you hold? How are you tending to what you need in other areas of your life so that this isn't consuming all of you? Where are you getting to be your whole self? Who are the people that show up to support you, and how can you strengthen and maintain those connections? So really, I mean, different things work for different people and in different balance, but one of the tools that I do offer that I think, whether organizationally or individually, has a tremendous impact, is creating a nervous system map, an individualized nervous system map. Because when people can see in their own body and their own nervous system and learn to really recognize some of the earlier signs of stress and burnout and depletion, so that you can be responding to those and taking care of what you need, recognizing. And this is an easy example in my life. When I'm dysregulated, I tend to get much more clumsy. I drop things, I trip, I run into doors and furniture that are always in the same place, and yet for me, if I do that, I know that that's a sign that my nervous system is dysregulated, something's off. And that gives me a very quick clue now. I didn't always know that that was the case. So I just get more frustrated and more flustered and more like, now, okay, now what's going on here? But being able to recognize those individual indicators, then a person can make the choices that can help them to move back towards their more regulated nervous system state.
Yeah.
And from there, you're more effective. I mean, you communicate better, you think more clearly, you problem solve, you're more creative. And so when you're navigating these tough systems, those are the skills that you need to have fully online.
I really like that. Nervous system map. I like that. So I've never heard of that, but yeah.
Yeah, it's based on polyvagal theory, and Deb Dana has done a lot of work in it, and it's something that I facilitate with a lot of the organizations or individuals that I work with, just because so many people get so much out of it.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Right, we've got to go soon, but I do want to kind of ask you quite a challenging question, because it came up, and I know that people who are listening, they might be asking this question, right? So given that you're in this space, you've spoken about your own identity, you've spoken about the types of people that you have and you do work with, people might ask, well, as a Black woman, for instance, why would I work with you? Does that question come up?
Not usually from the people who contact me, just because they already know that they're contacting a white woman when they're contacting me. So they may have already made that decision. I don't try to convince anybody to work with me. I look at it the same way. As a therapist, there's lots of therapists out there. There's lots of therapy approaches, different styles and personalities. I'm not going to try to pretend that I'm the best for everyone. And that includes, I'm not the best for every white person. I'm not the best for every woman. I'm not, I'm not the best for every person in my age group. So it's most important to me, the cultural competency piece, is that I'm not assuming about whoever I'm working with, that I'm getting to know them for who they are and what parts of their experience maybe are similar to mine, maybe are different. But I'm not going to assume that just because somebody looks like me or somebody doesn't look like me, what their experience is or has been. I want to help them by getting to know and understand what their experience is, and help to support them in making the choices that are going to serve their health and their well-being the best. And so I do know that there's definitely a shortage of Black psychologists. And so I know some excellent Black psychologists, and I also know that they can't serve everybody. And so, if I can be a resource for people, I want to be available and do that to the best of my ability. But if somebody needs and wants to work with somebody who shares that part of their identity, there are times where that's entirely necessary and appropriate and valid, and I fully support that too.
Yeah. Thank you for answering that. Yeah. Okay. I mean, thank you so much for your wisdom, your insight, and I think people will be interested in your resource in how to manage or to approach certain difficult conversations. And so, please do share with people how they can get hold of you.
Sure. So the 5 Ways to Speak Up resource you can find on my website. You can go directly to it by going to RebeccaEPHD.com/5 ways, WAYS. And my Rebecca spelling is REBECCA. So it's RebeccaEPHD.com/5 ways. My website in general has a lot of information about my services, as well as a contact form. And I'm also on LinkedIn. You can find me under Rebecca Eldredge PHD, and love to hear from anybody about what connected, what resonated, or any areas where you disagree or see things differently than what we talked about here today. It's great to hear from people.
Fabulous. Thank you again. And all that information I'll make sure that we put on our website, and also wherever people are listening to the podcast, they can also get those links. So just brilliant. Thank you. I wish you all the best. May you influence many more people as positively and as compassionately as you do already. And yeah, thank you.
Oh, thank you. It's so much fun to have this conversation with you, Rebecca. I appreciate your time.